In chapter 41 of Genesis, the life of Joseph takes a very drastic, positive turn. For 13 years, he has been abused, a slave, in jail, and so forth. And now things begin to turn for him. And it all wraps around a dream. It says here that Pharaoh had a dream, and he dreamed of the 7 cows, sleek, in verse 2, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. And then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, and ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And then he has then in verse 4, the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. And then he woke up. Then he had another dream very similar. This has to do with ears of grain and so forth, but a very similar type of dream. But none of his wise men, none of his confidants could interpret the dream for him in verse 8. That's when the cupbearer remembers Joseph, finally, after 2 years. Joseph had interpreted his dream and the baker's dream positively for the cupbearer, negatively for the baker, but they came out accurately. And so he remembers that, and he finally steps up and tells Pharaoh about Joseph and what Joseph had done. So Pharaoh had nothing to lose, I guess. So he takes a shot, and he brings in Joseph to see if Joseph can interpret these dreams. They're very troubling to him. What could these dreams mean? So Pharaoh says he's heard about him. He knows that you, verse 15, can interpret dreams. And Joseph immediately gives all the credit to God, and he continues to do so throughout the chapter. In verse 16, he says, "It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And then down in verse 25, he says, God has told Pharaoh what he's about to do. Then all the way over to verse 32, he says this, "The matter is determined by God." And all 3 times he gives the credit not to himself, but to God. And also notice, Pharaoh had no concept of Jehovah. There had been nobody in Egypt to explain to him anything about Yahweh, about Jehovah. He worshipped myriads of gods. The Egyptians had a whole pantheon of gods. Matter of fact, the Exodus is a real rebuke to the gods of Egypt. That's pretty much what was happening there. But they had dozens and dozens and dozens of gods. Everything had a god. But Jehovah wasn't one of them. And so when Joseph starts talking about the fact that that God is going to give these answers, this was pretty foreign to Pharaoh. He wouldn't know who Yahweh even was, but that's who's getting the credit by Joseph here. And later on, Pharaoh doesn't seem to catch on anyway, but nevertheless, the credit all goes to God, not to Joseph. So Joseph interprets the dream. And the dream interpretation is basically this. There's going to be a 7 good years of harvest and so forth in the land of Egypt, verse 26 on down. And then it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine, and the world's going to be devastated. And then he says to Pharaoh, he says, "Now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact a fifth of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance." So he gives him very practical, specific advice. Look, tax your people 1/5 of all this abundance. They're going to be overflowing with crops anyway. Tax them 1/5, store it away for those years of famine. And then verse 36, let the food become a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine. What wonderful advice he gives Pharaoh here at this point. Well, Pharaoh is impressed, not with God, unfortunately. He's impressed with Joseph. And he says to his confidants, he says, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. And he says to his friends, verse 38, can we find a man like this, to whom is a divine spirit? They didn't understand Jehovah God, but they did understand that he had something special going on. So they set Joseph up as the second in command of all the kingdom, verse 43. And he had him ride on his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, bow the knee. He is now the second in command of all of Egypt. And on top of that, Pharaoh gives the daughter of his priest to him as a wife in verse 45. And so he now has a wife, and he's going to have children. And verse 46 says he's 30 years old. Remember back in 37 too, he was 17. So all this has taken place over the last 13 years. We do find in verse 50 he has two sons. One is Manasseh, and the other is Ephraim. These will become leaders of two tribes of Israel. Now that makes 13 tribes, if you're counting properly, because now Joseph has two parts. So why is that the case? Well, that's going to be the case because Levi, the tribe of Levi, would not own property. They would become the priestly tribe. But in essence, there's 13 tribes that of Israel. And so the story ends by this the interpretation of the dream for being fulfilled. 7 years of good harvest, 7 years of famine, and Joseph oversees it all. God has purposely brought Joseph to the place to rescue basically the world of his day, and ultimately his own family, who are heirs of the promise of the covenant of Abraham. We'll see that as we go forward next week. I hope this has been a blessing to you as you study the Bible with us and go through these wonderful accounts found in the Old Testament scriptures.